There is Hagar, an utter outcast. Disadvantaged, she is a servant. But now she's been cast out and she is homeless and impoverished and exiled. She's at wit's end, beyond any imaginable hope or help. She is in the wilderness, hungry and thirsty, and her child is hungry and thirsty too, and wailing. There is the broader and more famous arc of story of Abraham and Sarah, their trials, and the large nation that they become. But this story of Hagar and Ishmael is a morally captivating nugget in the middle of that larger arc. Abraham and Sarah do not by any means behave well by Hagar. She has earlier been enjoined to bear a child, a surrogate child, for Sarah, because of that promise that they are supposed to become a nation that hasn't been fulfilled yet. Sarah is barren. And so they do what was, in their culture, fairly normal, and that is to use a slave woman as a surrogate to bear a child. So Hagar has Ishmael for Abraham as his son. While this practice was not unheard of, and families were certainly more complex back then, we do need to acknowledge that Hagar probably had very little moral agency in that situation. But now Sarah has, in fact, finally conceived and born a child, her own Isaac, and she decides that it is too much to have competition between her son Isaac and Ishmael. Strangely, the two of them, these two children, simply playing together and laughing is the moment that brings up this outrage in Sarah, this sense of panic. None but mine only, she thinks. There is no possibility that the blessing can multiply, only that the blessing is in competition, and she wants Ishmael out. Abraham complies. Now we are told that at least he must have had some bout of bad conscience about it, and I imagine him tossing and turning all night in guilt, and God coming to him in the specter of the dream and promising him that all will be well. So Abraham does as Sarah asks and casts Hagar and the young boy Ishmael out. Did Abraham tell Sarah about his dream? I mean, he is somewhat absolved in the scripture. Scripture can be very generous with its male heroes, but it leaves us just shreds with which to make sense of Sarah and of many of the women in Scripture. So remember, last week we had to dig deep into Sarah's laughter to understand something about her, but we see more of her moral complexity as she jaggedly lives into the paradoxical promises of God in this story. But from Hagar's perspective, it is nothing but grim. The one already powerless in the context of the whole tribe of Abraham where women are already low on the hierarchy and a servant is pretty much the lowest, a servant woman the very lowest. Hagar is now literally cast out, an outcast with no resources. How is she to survive and her child with her? Hagar, with nothing in possession except for her love for her child, wanders about with a little bread and a skein of water. And they become parched and very thirsty. The child must have been whimpering with thirst in a way that was just heart-wrenching, and so she can bear it no longer, and so sets the child some distance from her and sits down herself in her despair, which is unfathomable. She is tearless, she is so parched, and yet wailing nevertheless for God's mercy. I can't bear to see the child die, she says. But God's voice comes to her too with a promise. She too will be the grandmother of a great nation, and the surprise of this voice from God opens her eyes to see that just there, beyond the child, over the child's shoulder, is a wellspring. Ishmael will live, and so will she. Just when it appears that the blessings have narrowed down to only Abraham and Sarah, God makes the blessings wider again. God's promise to Sarah and Abraham, you see, is not exclusive. It is not to be so closely held, though Jews and Christians for many centuries have lived as if it were so. Our particularity, we think, our unique inheritance, we think, of land and blessing and promise. So who do we exclude from the blessings? As Americans, we wonder what resources we have. Can we share them with immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees? How will our own children be blessed if we share resources in that way? As white people, we wonder, can we give black and brown people a leg up with things such as affirmative action at the cost of our own children getting into the prestigious college or getting the exclusive job? As residents of wealthier towns, we want to hoard our educational dollars to our own school systems, and thereby we create segregated and unequal education. As people of privilege, we create our private roads and communities, beaches and parks so that our tribe will have access, but they will not. Over and over again, we set limits on God's blessings. Shame on us. Let us confess it. Alas, it is also human nature, our limited vision, our subtle but persistent fears for our own children, our view of resources as limited, our lack of trust in God's provisioning. We make in our minds a zero-sum game out of blessing, a narrowing of our obligations to take care of our own children, our own tribe exclusively in nuclear terms. But God's blessing is wider. Where we are tempted to hoard God's blessing, God's voice comes directly to those who have been cast aside, directly saying, you too will inherit the blessing. You too will be part of the people of promise. Now, this is absolutely good news to those who have been cast aside, and any who are outsiders should come and receive the truest and fullest message of God's blessing and promise. This is also good news for those of us who have been stingy with the blessing. God sees us and makes way for us to be blessed too, in ways that abound precisely when we no longer have the imagination to see how generous God's blessings are. We don't need to claim these blessings exclusively. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And when we open our hearts and let ourselves go back in the line a little bit, we discover there are rich blessings for us in sharing and in seeing the wideness of God's provisioning. God calls us to generosity, to fearlessness, to mutual care, to drop our win-lose math, the zero-sum game that we expect God's blessing to be. We who have been petty and limiting of God's grace are called to a wider imagination. There is a wideness in God's mercy. God's blessings are vastly wider than are we.